what I want to do is just go over what the main points on some of my blogs and some of my books are, and what ideas I'm trying to get across. I could call it augmented personal responsibility. I could call that to be a way to summarize the philosophy. My thing, the start off point for my thing has always been the right to be liberated, which is a libertarian idea, not to be driven by the demands of the group that you belong to. And yet, the more you get into yourself, the more you realize how dependent you are on others and how dependent they are on you, and how this can break down and how much tension this can lead to. And this is something we're seeing over and over again in the political climate, particularly now, given what happened in 2016. But to me, equality is kind of an abstraction. And we talk about not simply equal rights for gays. We talk about marriage equality, for example, in the gay community, and that is kind of an abstraction, because in practice, the implications of what we call equality are not the same as what the politically correct left says. In practice, if you're not, but particularly before we had same-sex marriage, in practice, if you weren't married and didn't have children, a lot of times you had fewer responsibilities. A lot of times you usually weren't raising kids, so a lot of times you took on less debt. A lot of times, if you did have a good job, you had more disposable income. So in a sense, you weren't equal, but in some ways you were better, and in some ways you were worse. It's kind of like a chess position where both sides have different strengths and weaknesses, and where it's hard, like the Sicilian defense in chess, where it's hard to say who's better. It isn't equal in an absolute sense, like a king and pawn ending in a chess game with just two kings left on the board. That doesn't mean a whole lot to me personally. One of the things too with equality is that if you don't have children, you could wind up being responsible for other people's children, which is an idea that we call filial responsibility. And in some states, you can be held responsible for the medical bills of your parents, or for making sure they get elder care. You can be held legally responsible. These laws haven't been enforced very often. There was a case in Pennsylvania recently where somebody got in trouble this way. But it is something the media hasn't talked about very much. But it is something media, one of these ideas the media ought to pay more attention to. If you have kids, then of course you have the possibility that somebody will be around to take care of you. And also when you have kids, you learn to take care of someone who's dependent on you. And so when later in adult life some kind of situation comes up where you may have to accept the fact that someone's going to depend on you, you're better prepared to handle it if you did have children. And even the libertarian community has been coming around to saying this sometimes, that as you know, there is some tension in the political system, even more in Europe than the United States, because native European populations that are well off, when they are better off, the better educated populations, don't have as many children, whereas children in other minorities, and this is particularly true in Europe of Muslim populations, and sometimes it's true of people of color in the United States, although not always, tend to have more children. So there is a possibility that over time there can be real political consequences. And that's not something, particularly in Europe, that you can ignore forever. So I think that's actually a significant issue in the long run. As far as what we call identity politics, for example, I've never been able to accept just joining somebody's group and becoming another one of their mouthpieces, or even, I don't generally respond to petitions to call my senator over the latest narrow vote on some bathroom bill or some very narrow piece of legislation. because some particular group of people will get hurt. Because there's so many of these that it becomes meaningless. So I figure you have to really lay everything out and see how everything interconnects. You have to connect the dots and you have to do the math. Which is, you know, like on the healthcare debate. Again, I see it as doing the math. If young people don't want to pay for other people's care, if we want to give young adults a break because they got student loan debt and make their premiums lower and not make them take coverage they don't need, fine. But then you're going to have to provide more subsidies for the people with pre-existing conditions who do need it. And you're going to have to really make sure you provide the subsidies. You might let the states do it, but then again, some of the states are not going to do it. You know, the whole issue with federalism. So, yeah, you got to sit down, do the math, and then you got to figure out what it takes to cover everybody. And no one's been willing to do that. But anyway, you know, I'm not one who wants to take sides. I'm one that would solve the problem. You know, if I was working for, yeah, I could help the GOP solve this problem, but they'd have to pay for the coverage for the people who really need it, which would mean a lot of people wouldn't get their tax cuts. It would maybe mean a lot of other things like reinsurance and crossing state lines and setting up affinity groups and so forth. But maybe doing away with the employer market and making everything on the same field. But yeah, you've got to solve the problem. No one's been willing to do that yet. Racial, to me, there's more value in talking about people in a group when you're talking about race because of the history of slavery and segregation and, you know, all kinds of other discrimination than there is when talking about other cultural groups that have to do with behavior. Now, religion is really a behavior too. Even though we think of it as a minority, practicing religion is actually behavior. So it's not just sexual behavior. But that's how I've always felt about it. There are, I think that one of the things I noticed in my life is that I was expected as a male to be able to do certain things to fit into the group, the family, for the good of others in the family or for the good of others in the community. As a male, I was supposed to be able to help protect women and children, and sometimes I was expected to be able to fit into a group like the military when I was drafted, as a fungible person who could be expendable for the long-time good of the group so that others would survive. That contradicts our idea of respect for life. It's always seemed like a contradiction to me that will outlaw abortion, but will draft young men and send them to their death. I mean, in both cases, you're failing to honor human life up to the point that you would want to. So logically, it's always seemed like a contradiction to me.